and most of them are due to head injury. Injuries to the eyes are found in 10 to 13% of all injuries. Common with the head may cause ocular complications ranging from immediate to late complications and sequelae. They may result from direct and indirect injuries. Aim of the study was to evaluate the cause of head injury, to evaluate various ocular manifestations in case of head injury, to evaluate correlation between pupillary changes and transverse of light in patients with head injury. It was a prospective analytical study of 594 cases of head injury with ocular manifestations, and relevant data was statistically analyzed. Age distribution, if you see, most of the cases they fall under the age group of 21 to 30 years, and of course males were predominantly affected. So maximum number of patients were in the age group of 21 to 40, and males were about 81% as compared to females. If we see the causes of head injury, the vehicular accidents accounted for 70% of all injuries, and then comes assaults and the fall from height, etc. Common site of injury was frontal region, that is 44.4%, and then followed by temporal parietal. Ocular manifestations in cases of head injury were so many, starting from ecchymosis, second there were hemorrhage, necrosis, nerve involvements, ocular wall fractures, exposure keratitis, and so on, multiple injuries as well. If we look at ocular manifestations in head injury with respect to the site of trauma, this is the frontal side where we find that most of the ocular manifestations are there. As far as pupillary changes are concerned, we found in 21% of the cases the pupillary changes were there, and in 3.8% it was fixed pupil dilated, not taking to light. In bilaterally dilated and fixed pupil, mortality rate was found to be 96%. In bilaterally constricted and fixed pupil, mortality rate was 91.3%. So it is a very, very important parameter to be discussed. And incidence of post-traumatic ocular motor nerve involvement shows that the third nerve involvement has occurred mainly in the frontal side of injury as compared to parietal, and sixth nerve involvement was seen mainly in parietal injuries. So we analyzed our data with appropriate statistical indices by p-value, z-factor, relative risk, and chi-square values, and we found a highly significant correlation between male sex and road traffic accident as cause of injury, and a very significant correlation with the age group 21 to 40 years and road traffic accident as a cause of injury. Correlation between the manifestations like late edema, ecchymosis, open-interval hemorrhage, and frontal side of injury, and there is a significant correlation between the dilated or pinpoint pupils with mortality. Correlation between frontal and parietal region as a site of injury and frontal involvement is all these manifestations were highly significant. So we saw that the commonest cause of head injury reported in other studies as well with the ocular manifestations. Raju NST also reported about 47% of cases with head injury and ocular manifestations. Kulkarni also reported that the commonest eye finding was ecchymosis, followed by subconjunctival hemorrhage as in ours. And Vaipur Singh and V.K. Chawla also reported 55% cases were found to be pupillary changes. In this series, it was 100% mortality with bilaterally dilated pupil. Kulkarni stated that among 200 cases head injury, pupillary involvement was seen in 6.5% of cases. Regarding ocular motor palsies, our findings are consistent with other studies. So we conclude that the males are more predominantly predisposed, and most common age group involved was 21 to 40 years. Common site of injury was frontal region, then comes temporal parietal. It was positive correlation was observed between frontal site of injury and manifestations like late edema, ecchymosis, etc. as compared to the parietal injuries. So in cases where the pupils were dilated or pinpoint, bilaterally dilated or pinpoint not taking to light, had 10 times higher risk of mortality than the patients without pupillary involvement, and third nerve involvement was seen in about 3 times more frequently in frontal and parietal region injuries as compared to other sites of injuries. Sixth nerve was involved in 4.6 times more frequently in parietal region injuries. So the carry-home message is that head injury has high incidence of ocular manifestations. Hence, the ocular manifestations should be very carefully looked for in each case of head injury. Pupillary involvement should be very carefully evaluated as it can go a long way in predicting the survival of the patient. Ocular examination in head injury has a great synergistic role in diagnosis, prognosis, and subsequent management. These are the witnesses. Thank you so very much for your patient hearing. Thanks.
Good presentation. And any questions from the audience? May I ask did you find posterior segment changes posterior segment?
Sir, actually we have not mentioned these changes here, but we have actually seen all these changes starting from lobe rupture to all like audience current layers.
That's what surprising. One would have liked to see seen the posterior segment manifestation mentioned also.
Thanks.
We will now start with the second paper, which is on changing paradigm in eye injuries over a 16-year period. The chief and presenting author is Dr. Sanjay Chaudhary.
A very good morning to the dignitaries and my dear colleagues. Here are 4 pictures depicting one contact level getting cold, one severely acid burn face, one nearly strangulated lady, young bride, and a firecracker injury. Common thing is they all had eye involvement. Keeping this picture in mind, I present my study changing paradigm in eye injury over 15 years. As noted on the same interest, these are my abstract. Injury literally means not right, but the paradox remains it misses the epidemiologist is, as it is usually causes monocular losses. But impact is enormous because victims are usually of productive age group and many days are lost. Compounded with this is the reducing regular workforce replaced by contract labor and violence against women. Despite increased awareness and better management, incidence remains the same. That was the lacuna. Analysis of all post-agential events involved with eye injuries during last decade was our aim. Prospective intervention study on all cases of ocular trauma. Study period was from 1997 to 2012. Serious visual impairment was recorded as visual impairment on presentation or advised bed rest for more than 24 hours. Our methods include simple comprehensive ocular examination. As everyone in the population was theoretically at risk for eye injury, the denominator is the population. P-value more than 0, less than 0.5 was found significant. Now coming to the results. Our 15-year study, we found 12,365 cases, of which 1,241 cases were serious who needed hospitalization or rest. Mean age was 45.8 with bimodal pattern of incidence, highest on the 3rd decade and 6th decade, 3:1 female ratio. The most startling fact was that 48% of our injuries were workplace related, and that to 90% of them were marginal laborers, that is contract laborers, which are often ignored in the study. Another startling fact was 1862 cases of injuries in female, of which 60% of injuries were related to social violence. Multivariate analysis has detected as a new risk factor. There are different types of injuries we have come across during this long study. Our commonest injury was non-serious in nature. Serious cases, 80% had closed loop injuries. When Sabdhani Hati to Garana Hati, any time injury can occur. But in this study, we have noted a serious festivity injuries in 18.5% of cases, which included fireworks, that too from unexploded firecrackers, ophthalmia nodosa, when during Diwali they go for banana trees, they hit with caterpillar. And hand pumping tubal injury is another. In Muharram time, we found fluorescent tube and sharp ulnar injury. Coming to the nature of the injury, as I have mentioned, the prevalence was 0.45 per 1,000 population. Bokaro has a population of 20 lakhs. 80% had closed flow injuries. Our mean incidence was 824. But the most important factor I would like to stress is the marginal workers' injury has increased exponentially, and that is highly significant, P less than 0.01. That too in social injury in female has also increased, that was also significant. Some injury elements came into our notice during this study, were distribution of bicycles, mosquito nets for malaria and other things. They were not properly maintained and they gave rise to different injuries. Bikes related injuries, where motor mechanics, garages are come mushrooming in and around without proper training, they suffer a lot. Fencing related injuries, fencings are replaced by metal sheets. All sorts of different injuries have come out in this study. Comorbidity, 4.5 cases per year was the incidence of eye injury in comorbid cases. These are the tabulated form of the data, and this is the graphical presentation of the data. You can really appreciate that in females it's increasing, in regular workforces it's decreasing, in marginal workers it's increasing exponentially. Here what I mentioned is the composite picture of eye injuries in marginal laborers. And here it is injuries in females. This young girl, you might remember, I will not name her, severely acid burned young girl. I had the opportunity to treat her during her young age. Now what she does. And this interesting case was bilateral supplemental hemorrhage. When inquired, it was a case of throttling. When counseled, her family and she could be saved. There are other injuries, these are common, not insignificant. This I again want to stress. During holy season, they slips over the handle of the hand pump and fall on hit the eye, give rise to loss of eyeball. We found 4 such cases. Unaccustomed labor and fencing, see, from bamboo it has become to metal paints. The auto rickshaw you can see in the villages also, where the mechanics are not trained. Again, faulty protection during working. This also predisposes to eye injury. Traffic accidents are very common to cause eye injuries. Household injuries. OTC drugs in abrasion is another case of blinding eye lesions. So what I coined the term is social eye injury in women after going through this study. And another thing is the comorbidity leading to ocular trauma. This is also a very significant result came out of this study. So see, whatever the mode of the injury, sequel become devastating, and picture can say it better. Coming to the discussion, festivity-related injury increase due to no proper statutory warnings. Marginal worker was poorly covered by ESI, RSPUI, pre-deployment checkup, and less reporting due to retrenchment fear. Female injuries also depict socio-economic imbalance. So to conclude, the greatest change in the paradigm of ocular trauma is yet to come. We must understand the host, agent and event reaction to prevent or rehabilitate. These things are preventable or reducible if we counsel during pre-festival at schools and temples and mosques, pre-deployment health checkup, and wider PSI coverage. Eye injuries in females should be suspected as beginning of serious social violence. My take-home message is always look beyond the injuries to make a healthy society. These are my references. Do we care? Yes, we ophthalmologists do care. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Sanjay. Just a question.
Please.
You mentioned various indications of chemical injuries and other kinds of injuries.
Yes.
In a pediatric population, I didn't see anywhere you mentioned about eye injury, which is fairly commonly seen. As a tertiary care, we see a lot of people coming from north where the children have played with line packets. That's something which maybe as ophthalmologists we should be emphasizing.
Yes. That is in the 16 to 18 years group. It is during dualism when you put the line and that bus.
Basically, they go out to get tuna and then they play with the packet and it works. Because in Chennai, whatever, as a tertiary care center, all children with chemical injuries are invariably children who have played with line packet, it bursts and it goes in the air.
In our case, it's slightly different. Every time during the they have to do tuna work. So when they keep the tuna and put the water plus.
Dr. Chaudhary's paper has great social relevance. The point that was made out of the females injuries in females getting.
In our marginal workers, we have got highest.
What about social relevance in the study?
26% of marginal.
Can we go to the next step, please?
I have a question for Dr. Chaudhary.
Thank you. We'll start off with the next speaker who will speak on visual outcome and prognostic factors in management of traumatic cataract associated with open globe injury. The presenting author is Dr. Samrat Chatterjee. The next speaker for the next talk, Dr. Anchal, can also be ready with the slides.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My paper is on traumatic cataract associated with open globe injury, the visual outcome and the prognostic factors. I have no financial disclosure. The challenging issues when we deal with traumatic cataract in the presence of an open globe injury are the restoration of the ocular integrity as a primary step, the removal of the damaged lens, and once you remove the damaged lens, we need to think about the visual rehab and at the same time have simultaneous control of inflammation and we need to prevent glaucoma and infection. So the aim of this present study is to actually see the visual outcome and to identify the prognostic factors following traumatic cataract in an open globe injury setting. This was a retrospective case series that we did over the last 6 years, and we included all patients with corneal tear and traumatic cataract, excluded those with presence of endophthalmitis at presentation, and if the tear had been primarily repaired outside, and if we could not record the vision. So the management protocol in the institute was the primary repair of all corneal and scleral laceration on the phanon cable. The surgeon decided, depending on the intraoperative clarity and integrity of the lens capsule, whether to remove the cataract at the same sitting and implant a lens, or to do it at the secondary setting, which we call as secondary cataract surgery with IOL implantation. And because of the restricted nature, this was the preferred approach, and I'll discuss that later on. And following that, we have intensive topical antibiotics and topical steroids to control inflammation and prevent infection. And the corneal sutures were removed at 3 months. And we defined good outcome as a best corrected visual acuity of 20/40 or better at 6 months, and a poor outcome as best corrected visual acuity less than 20/40. And we examined all these variables in an univariate model, and those in the univariate model that were statistically significant, we put it into a model for multiple logistic regression. So we had a total of 83 patients, of which 18 were excluded due to endophthalmitis, a loss to follow, and visual acuity which was not recorded, and finally we analyzed 65 patients. And there was a preponderance of males, and the main age group preponderance was also the young adults. Out of 65, 28% underwent primary cataract surgery, and 45% underwent a secondary cataract surgery, that is a cataract surgery at a later date. In another 28% of cases, partial lensectomy was done because there was lens material in the vitreous cavity. IOL in the same sitting was implanted in 18%, and in 2% we did not implant in IOL at the primary setting. Of the surgical technique, a very brief allusion to it, we did phacoemulsification in 12%, simple candle aspiration in 60%, and removal of dispersed lens matter from the anterior chamber and from the vitreous in 28%. This is a scatter plot that shows the pre- and post-operative visual acuity. You can see that the pre-operative visual acuity is significantly worse, and that statistic and the post-operative visual acuity becomes significantly improved, and this was statistically significant. In our series, we found that around 42% of patients had a good outcome, while 57% of patients had a bad outcome according to our definition. And when we look at the data in the univariate analysis model, we found that age, gender, the size of the corneal wound, the presence of a lens or the absence of a intraocular lens, the integrity of the posterior capsule, the occurrence of glaucoma or severe inflammation or astigmatism did not affect the outcome. Instead, what affected the outcome was a primary cataract surgery, that is when the cataract was removed at the time of repair of the corneal scleral injury, where the posterior segment was involved, and we had in 18% of cases where the posterior segment was involved with various causes, the visual outcome was poor. And when the corneal laceration encroached onto the visual axis. And when we put all these three positive things in the multivariate analysis, we found that corneal laceration that involved the visual axis and presence of any posterior segment lesion had a poor outcome. So when we analyzed our visual outcome data with studies that have been previously published, and there are numerous, we found that our results were significantly good and comparable. And when we examined the prognostic factors, very few papers are actually alluded on the prognostic factors with good statistical analysis, but we found that in children with myopia and retinal detachment, corneal scar, cerebral astigmatism, again posterior segment injury, to be significant factors that affected poor outcome, whereas in our cases with the multiple logistic model, we found that a corneal tear that encroached on the visual axis and posterior segment complications would be associated with a poor outcome. Important factor that comes in dealing with this kind of injury is the timing of the cataract surgery, and there's a lot of debate about this. Due to the retrospective nature and also due to the nature of the injury, we could not come to a definite conclusion whether a primary cataract surgery is more better than a secondary cataract surgery, because usually in our setting there was a bias to defer the cataract surgery to a later date whenever the corneal clarity, whenever the extent of injury or the presence of hyphema did not allow us to be very sure about the integrity of the posterior capsule and also to the degree of the injury, its ultimate components. So we deferred the surgery. So this study could not actually could not definitely comment on the timing of the cataract surgery, but it still has its strengths, and what we found was that our visual outcome was comparable and we had a moderately good visual outcome. The opaque lens in a setting of open toe injury will not be removed at the primary setting, and the prognostic factors that were associated with the poor visual outcome in our series was a corneal tear that involved the visual axis and the presence of posterior segment complications like detachment or traumatic fracture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good presentation.
Thank you.
But did you take into account for primary IOL implantation, use the power of the other eye you said?
Yeah.
And also in the secondary IOL implantation?
In the secondary IOL implantation, if we did it after removal of the corneal tear, we examined the KV and we did a normal keratometry. And we used, if it was significantly different from that of the uninjured eye, then we favor the uninjured eye. And even for the IOL power calculation for the in the secondary setting, the sutures were there, he took the reading of the other eye. So we can put this other eye.
One thing.
And also we took a history to find out if the child was very difficult, generally whether they had significant difference in vision before that to rule out any degree of cancer.
You said your bias was towards secondary
cataract.
Now, except in that you have reverse bias, or do you consider a reverse bias of early primary IOL implantation in age groups, in ambulogenic age groups?
No, because until and unless we are very sure about our clarity on cable, sometimes you can have a clear cornea, but you can have a hyphema, and or the iris could be significantly distorted. So we do not go for the primary surgery unless on cable we were completely sure of the extent of injury and our visualization. So mostly the primary surgeries were those which had a very small corneal tear. So that's why in the univariate analysis we got a good result, but which did not stand up in the multivariate model.
Thank you. We'll start off with the next paper on retained intraocular foreign body, IOP removal, a retrospective study of 300 cases by Dr. Anand.
Very good morning, respected judges, colleagues and friends. I will be presenting a retrospective study of 300 cases with retained intraocular foreign body. None of the authors have any financial interest. Intraocular foreign body is one of the most common preventive causes of unilateral blindness in the economically productive age groups. Hence, the aims and objectives of my study were to determine the type and mode of injuries, to evaluate the relative efficacy of different diagnostic modalities available for localization, and also to evaluate the prognostic factors associated with removal and final visual outcome. The patients included in the study were those presenting or referred with intraocular foreign body and were operated at our center by the same surgeon. Also, cases where foreign body removal was attempted elsewhere but failed. However, patients who were not available for a minimum follow-up of 6 months were excluded from the study. A proper history and ophthalmic examination was done, followed by localization of the foreign body using various modalities. Once the foreign body was localized, surgery was performed with full informed consent, and in cases when required, a second surgery was performed. The follow-up period ranged from 6 months to 2 years. For localizing the foreign body, first an indirect ophthalmoscopy was done. If the foreign body was visible, X-ray was done only for documentation purposes. However, when the foreign body was not visible on ophthalmoscopy, an X-ray or B-scan was advised. If the intraocular nature of the foreign body was still not confirmed, only then a CT scan was ordered. Also, CT scan was done for cases with badly lacerated wounds and where the foreign body removal had been attempted elsewhere but had failed. Once the foreign body was confirmed, we moved ahead to surgery. The surgery mainly involved primary repair, with or without cataract removal, followed by pars plana vitrectomy and foreign body removal. If retinal detachment was present at the time of surgery, endolaser, siliconized gas or other tamponading agents were used, followed by intravitreal antimicrobial injections. Similarly, as and how complications presented, repeat surgery was performed. Coming to the results, we found that 97% of the patients were male, of which 42% were in the age group of 21 to 30 years. Also, 98% of the foreign bodies were metallic in nature, and hammer and chisel was the most common mode of injury. 52.66% of these patients presented to us within a time interval of 2 to 7 days from the time of injury. Also, various modalities were used singly or in combination to localize the foreign bodies, and it was found that in 41.32% of the cases, foreign body could be localized by indirect ophthalmoscopy and X-ray alone. Of the associated injuries seen, the most common were traumatic cataract, endophthalmitis, retinal detachment, and corneal tear. Foreign body was removed in all the cases, and it was seen that in 73.33% of the patients, the foreign body was impacted in the eye holes. If we see the final visual outcome, 45.33% patients could achieve a final visual acuity of more than 636, whereas only 3.33% patients were left with no clear. If we compare between the pre and post-operative vision, as we can see here, almost 88% patients had a vision of less than 660 pre-operatively. However, 51.33% had this vision post-operatively. Similarly, 12% patients had a vision of more than 636 pre-operatively, and post-operatively this vision was seen in almost 45.33% patients. Coming to the prognostic factors, if the presenting visual acuity was more than 636, the final visual acuity of more than 636 was seen in almost 83% cases. However, those who had a presenting visual acuity of less than 660, only 40.15% cases had this vision. Similarly, patients who presented within 7 days had a better visual outcome compared to those who presented after 7 days. Most of the foreign bodies were found to be impacted in the eye codes, and it is seen that this is associated with are most commonly affected. Metallic foreign bodies are mostly found. They are mostly impacted on the eye codes, and hammer and chisel is the most common mode of injury. Indirect ophthalmoscope, X-ray and B-scan can locate foreign body in most cases. CT scan is not mandatory for localization. Also, the exact location of the foreign body need not be ascertained, but it is important to know whether the foreign body is intraocular or extraocular in nature. Also, the standard procedure for all foreign bodies lost in the posterior segment would be pars plana vitrectomy, followed by removal of the foreign body with magnets or forceps. Also, a visual acuity of more than equal to 636 can be achieved in 45.33% cases. The major predictors of the final visual outcome would be the presenting visual acuity, the time of presentation, the location of the foreign body, and the presence or absence of complications like endophthalmitis, retinal detachment, etc. Thank you.
Good presentation. Just one point from what is the timing of presentation. Now, do you care to examine how many cases in your study presented late with an iron foreign body?
So most of these patients were referred from elsewhere. So a majority of the patients, as you can see, presented to us within a week. But cases where the foreign body was attempted to remove elsewhere, they were presented late. So the visual outcome was poor in these patients.
Any signs of cirrhosis found out when they presented late?
So yes, sir. The patients with cirrhosis, they were approximately around 3% of the cases, and they were the ones who usually presented late.
I have a question for you. What did you do with the patients of endophthalmitis with delayed intraocular foreign body and plus minus detachment? How did you approach those patients? Endophthalmitis with intraocular foreign body plus minus RD.
Okay. Patients who had endophthalmitis with retinal detachment, so first a vitrectomy was done, followed by removal of the foreign body, and if retinal detachment was present, tamponading agents were used, followed by an intravitreal antimicrobial injection.
What was the dose of intraocular antibiotics in the oil? What kind of dose you gave?
So could you repeat your question?
The dose of intravitreal antibiotics with silicon.
Sir, I'm not aware of this aspect.
They are given in charge.
We will go to the next page. paper. This is on outcome of primary iode implantation in traumatic cataract, a pediatric case series from Central India by Dr. Khushbu.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be talking on outcome of primary eye implantation in traumatic cataract, pediatric case series from Central India. No financial interest. In ocular injury, as we know, cataract constitutes as one of the major causes of vision loss, and in pediatric population, it causes amblyopia. In literature, conflicting data is available regarding timing of eye implantation, especially in case of penetrating injury. Primary eye implantation has a disadvantage like complicated implantation during an emergency procedure. IOL may act as an iris of infection, and always there is an inaccuracy of IOL power calculation. But it has an advantage like earlier visual rehabilitation and binocular functioning. It reduces the number of surgical procedures, and it is technically easier as there is no fibroblastic changes. Previous studies have shown good results of primary eye and traumatic cataract in certain limited subgroups, especially in adults. And none of the previous studies have done posterior optic buttonholing where indicated. So we aim to conduct a study to evaluate safety of primary implantation in traumatic cataract in pediatric population. It was a retrospective study. Patients less than 16 years with traumatic cataract who have undergone primary eye implantation were collected, and all injuries were classified with BEST classification. All patients in whom eye could not be implanted, like zone 3 injuries, endophthalmitis or RD, were excluded. Data collected were demographic delay, A-scan and biometry, intra and post-op complication, and best corrected visual acuity. IOL calculation were done using SRK2 formula, and in children less than 8 years, IOL of reduced power were implanted, and posterior capsulolysis and anterior vitrectomy were done in all cases less than 8 years. Foldable or rigid IOL were implanted depending upon the posterior capsular support, and amblyopic treatment were given if necessary. Optic buttonholing were done in case of ruptured posterior capsule with gross damage to the anterior capsule where stability of IOL was questionable. Outcome measure was safety of primary IOL. Statistical analysis were done using chi-square test. Total 661 eyes were included, of which 36% patients were within the amblyogenic age. Majority were male, and most common cause of trauma were wooden stick. Only 5% patient presented within 24 hours of trauma, and majority of the patient presented late. According to Bates classification, penetrating injury was the most common. This was a spectrum of associated comorbidities with traumatic cataract. In 86% of patients which performed cataract with IOL, while with corneal tear repair were done in 13.6% of patients. IOL was implanted in bag in 92% of patients, while optic buttonholing were done in 9.2% of the patients. This is a small video where corneal tear repair were done along with IOL. After primary corneal tear repair and lens matter aspiration, we found a large PCR. So we have implanted the IOL in bag, and then optic is captured behind the PCR. We can see the margin of PCR here, and then the optic is captured behind the PCR margin. This is the best corrected visual acuity at each follow-up, which shows 69% of our patients have achieved visual acuity of 0.47 logmark unit or better at last follow-up. Majority cause of poor vision in children were squint and amblyopia and corneal scarring involving the visual axis. Post-op complication we got is fibrin in anterior chamber and visually significant PCO. Second intervention required were intravitreal antibiotics for presumed endophthalmitis and iris stain in one case. Post-op intervention and optic capture were statistically non-significant in patients where corneal tear repair were done or not. Calculating the spherical equivalent, 98% of our patients achieve a spherical equivalent of within 3 diopters, while 2% have got spherical equivalent 3 to 5 diopters because of corneal scarring and high cylindrical power. In children, injuries commonly occur during sports and outdoor activities, and wooden stick is most common etiological factor. IOL offers a permanent optical correction, retention of stereopsis, better compliance with amblyopia therapy. Very few studies in the literature have compared the outcome of primary eye implantation, especially in pediatric population. Our sample size was very more than other studies, and we have achieved a final visual acuity of 0.7 logmark in 69% of patients, which is comparable with other studies. Optic capture in our study in only 2.7%. Probably we have done optic buttonholing in our series, and PCO we have achieved, got in 12% of our patients because we have done posterior axis in all patients less than 8 years. None of the patients with POBH develop optic capture, so posterior optic buttonholing should be done in patients with where in the bag IOL is not possible, especially with ruptured posterior capsule and associated gross damage to the anterior capsule. In our study, primary eye is an optimum choice as we got good visual outcome.
None of the side-threatening complications were directly attributable to presence of IL, and it is a better option than leaving patient awaiting and subjecting to secondary procedure. And it has a significant economic advantage in our country, where annual healthcare expenditure is less than 2,500 per person, and it should be a procedure of choice in a patient who may not follow up. To conclude, our results showed primary eye implantation in pediatric traumatic cataract is safe and should be preferred approach whenever practical. Thank you.
Nice presentation. How many patients you opt for a secondary procedure?
So actually this was 800 cases we have taken, and 200 patients we have excluded because of in 200 patients we have secondary eye implantation. That was not included in this study. Some patients have like poor visibility, and some had pre-existing RD and all. So in that patient we have not implanted IOL. So that patients were excluded.
May I have a question, please?
Just one.
You said that primary IOL implantation is good.
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine, that's what we should achieve. But then to get it, say, compare it with the secondary IOL implantation, did you do any statistical analysis to have a significant...
Sir, we are also conducting one study to compare primary versus secondary IOL. Probably...
No, in this study?
No, sir. In this study, I have only included the patient with primary IOL implantations. We have not compared any secondary.
The next paper is on artificial iris and iris IOL implantation in post-traumatic anhydria by Dr. Polony Sese.
Good morning. The time is very pleasure for me to get meet a lot of friends of India. People.
Without any bias, Cesar is a dear friend and he is famous all over the world for his ocular trauma videos.
So, speak about the problem of eyes, or in case of severe ocular trauma, and the protocol approach, and the middle focusing on iris reconstruction. Therefore, protocol service is architects between anterior and posterior segment, as you know, using cornea, with retina, and be careful iris, and then implantation of nostril, cornea, and then final tamponade. And for me, we get the illusion anatomical area between the back surface of the iris and the anterior medial channel. It represents the border area among the anterior and posterior segment. And often it's with certain reasons in surgical treatment. But the first thing is, in every case, try to save the iris. But if not possible, we can use now the artificial iris for post-traumatic anhydria or large iris coloboma. It's a 4-second iris implant custom-made with measured or without measure. This is the video for you can see the top of video, after I show only short cases. Like this, for example, case with anhydria, first operation, trauma, vitrectomy, and change corneal decay. This is part of the sky. Second operation, the site after removal silicone oil, so implantation of artificial iris with our idea to suturing under the surface of iris, the IOL, is where you can treat in the same moment aesthetic and refractive surgery. And of course, in this case, trauma, the progress of glaucoma, before glaucoma, after a long time, and no reaction to the topical therapy, so decided to move valve to treat the first time against the glaucoma. It's not depending, in my opinion, on the artificial iris, but for the trauma that destroyed completely. And in this case, because the patient was far from my hospital, we have associated in the same moment Ahmed valve and endoscopic destruction to obtain the best result is possible, like in this case, to treat and try to finish the series of the treatment. And then the last case with iris coloboma, in case of a boy, tested removal between 26 Mr. Chatelier with the light vesicle removal by special fresco cannula and posterior airway removal. Again, second step, try to remove an internal membrane after blue staining with the dust diamond down scraper in order to prevent the secondary ear deformation. And now attention to the iris. First, we test the elasticity of the residual traumatic iris using a spatula for massage and the forceps for stretching. This allows to unrolling the iris to increase the surface. First is try to see the iris using the natural iris. And then with the 10-0 prolonged sutured irises to remove the round pupil shape. But this can be limited by the stiffness and fatigue of the iris even if also young body. And now we decide to put the secondary or IOL scoring foundation in this situation because it's possible to obtain good centering. And now suturing asymmetrically. We try to conclude that the pupil passes asymmetrically so as to change strategy. In this case, it's possible to use the artificial iris custom made and the frame adapt the correct shape of the artificial iris using the scissors. And then after proceeding of 2 sutures between the artificial iris and the panoramic square, 1 per millimeter, use the second receive light to roll and insert the artificial iris using only 3.5 millimeter per opening. This is artificial iris with the mesh one. And then align and suture the artificial iris to the pupillar frame and use the top extremity gauge to offset the line. Then after the border of both natural and artificial eyes obtain the best aesthetic result. And the finishing looks with the tubular bundle trimming the artificial eyes by force and the scissors. You can trim as you prefer. So this is our specification in this case, the blank series case. We have at the moment 12, and then the last ascendances using spending time for trauma in the lab and spend the life for trauma. This announcement for the ISOP meeting in Croatia every 3 years, and the American Society of Opera Trauma organizes a meeting in now Europe and Croatia are quarterly in Belgium. Thank you for your attention.
Now for the next speaker, conclusion, Motive to speak on risk factors surrounding post-traumatic endophthalmitis.
Good morning, everyone. The title of our presentation is Study of Risk Factors Governing Post-Traumatic Endophthalmitis. We don't have any financial interest in conducting this study. Now, post-traumatic endophthalmitis is an intraocular infection involving the anterior and the posterior. History reports that 3.4% of cases of open glove injuries and endophthalmitis are the type of injury, the microbiological profile, wound contamination, treatment, and the most important being the written intraocular foreign body. The microbiological profile is Staphylococcus and Streptococcus in patients with chronic indolent cases. So in the present study, we attempted to identify the risk factors for the development of endophthalmitis in cases of open glove injuries by comparing patients who subsequently developed endophthalmitis with patients who didn't. The purpose of our study was to establish risk factors for the occurrence of post-traumatic endophthalmitis and to observe the efficacy of prophylaxis. It's a partially prospective case control study in a tertiary care center for a duration of 2 years, where 60 patients with open glove injuries were enrolled. We included patients with any age and gender and open glove injuries, and we excluded patients with irreparably damaged glove. This is the study protocol for our study, where all patients with related injury admitted and were surgically explored. Micrograde evaluation was done. Prophylactical intravenous antibiotics, topical antibiotics, and capabilities were given. The type of intervention was decided and was done. Post-operatively intravenous antibiotics, oral steroids were given, and post-op visual acuity was recorded. This is one of the methods. This was snap for one of the methods for the vitreous aspirate sampling. We studied the following parameters like age and gender, injury setting whether it was indoor or outdoor, wound contamination, the nature of injury, corneal, whether it is scleral or both, mechanism of injury, prophylactic antibiotics, administrating including the route and timing, the timing of primary repair, and lancethamine and intravitreal antibiotics or corticosteroids given at the time of primary repair. Any association between these parameters and subsequent development of endophthalmitis was investigated. Association between the endophthalmitis and the final visual acuity was also evaluated, and the chi-square test and the Fisher test was used for the statistical analysis. The mean age of patients in our study was 30.21 years, with the predominant population being males. 8.80% of patients developed endophthalmitis post-trauma. By univariate analysis, the 5 factors which were strongly responsible for development of post-traumatic endophthalmitis was contaminated wound, retained intraocular foreign body, lens capsule breach, delayed repair, and road setting. By multivariate analysis, these 3 factors were the independent risk factors for the development of post-traumatic endophthalmitis. These were contaminated wound, lens capsule breach, and delayed repair. The final visual acuity was poor in post-traumatic endophthalmitis. The following factors were not related. These were patient's age, gender, injury setting, site of injury on eye, mechanism of injury, the antibiotic administration, lancectomy or intravitreal antibiotics given at the time of primary repair. And as said, the final visual acuity was worse in these patients. I would like to discuss two cases where the first one is was a 22-year-old male with kinetic injury due to eye nail while working at home. He presented after delay of 10 days to our OPD, and as a result of which the primary repair was done at the 12th day. The second case was 31-year-old with perforating injury with a stone hit while walking. The primary repair was done within 24 hours, and despite all the active measures and all the possible measures, the visual acuity was poor in this patient. Our results correlated with the other study on the similar topic. Like A. Gupta found the same, the delayed wound repair as significant risk factor, while Bhagat found that delayed wound repair and contaminated wound found to be the significant risk factors. Infectious agents are introduced at the time of primary repair. The trauma usually occurs in a non-sterile environment, which increases the risk of infection. Longer time between the injury and examination, poorer visual acuity at presentation, the violence of organisms, and the presence of intraocular foreign body were significant risk factors. Staphylococcus and streptococcus were the most frequent pathogens isolated. Intraocular injection bypasses the blood ocular barrier and appears to be the most effective method for achieving the concentration and thus control of development if it is given timely. Thus we conclude from our study that a dirty wound, delayed primary repair, and lens capsule breach were significant risk factors for development of post-traumatic endophthalmitis. In each case of trauma, these factors simply need to be evaluated to minimize the rate of endophthalmitis, and decision whether to administer prophylactic antibiotics remains controversial, but in presence of the above risk factors, this should always be considered. These were the references. Thank you.
Good presentation. Just to take you from what you were saying, the microbiological profile.
Yes.
Does it match the other study profile where Bacillus cereus and fungal because
yes, sir. Bacillus cereus we found in 2% of cases, but the most common in our study, depending upon the environment of what the geographical predisposing factors, we found Staphylococcus to be the most common agents in our study.
And you mentioned Gupta's study from PGI group.
Yes.
They also found wound longer than 8 mm to be one of the risk factors. Did you go to that area, explore that area?
No, sir. Only the factors which we included were correlated with other studies, sir, and the results were they were correlated.
You didn't include the length of the wound.
No, the length of wound was not included in our studies. Thank you.
Now we go to the next paper on congenital foreign body masquerading as ulcerative scleritis.
Congenital foreign body masquerading as ulcerative scleritis. The authors have no financial interest or relationships to this case. Well, foreign bodies could be just anything, something like this, or something more positive like this. And they can be also in the eye, and we all have our own experiences regarding the same. This is something which is very common, but allow me to present before you a case, an uncommon case, of a 37-year-old male who presented to us with redness, pain and watering for 1 month in his right eye. When he presented, he had no history of any ocular or head injury in the recent past. On examination, he had a best corrected visual acuity of 20/40 in the right eye and 20/20 in the left. The left eye was unremarkable. On straight lamp examination, the lid showed edema, permeable injection.
and there was a large punched out area with surrounding heaped up edges in the supratemporal quadrant of the globe, the base of which was seen to involve the underlying sclera. The size of this lesion was about 5 by 4 millimeters. The cornea also showed some filaments supratemporally with an epithelial defect. The rest of the anterior and posterior segment was within normal. Corresponding to the bulbar conjunctiva, there was a raised hyperemic ulcerated lesion on the tarsal conjunctiva. So based on the morphology and the non-conspicuous nature of the lesion, a presumptive diagnosis of tubercular conjunctivitis was made, and conjunctival scrapings and biopsy was ordered. The conjunctival scraping was non-conclusive, and the biopsy showed features of acute and chronic inflammation with special stains for fungus and AFP being negative. On histopathology, we could see the intraepithelial polymorphs, and the stroma showed lymphocytic infiltration with dilated blood vessels and stromal edema. Here is a picture with higher magnification showing intraepithelial polymorphs. On systemic workup, the hemogram, ESR, and CRP were normal, and as the infection pathology had been ruled out, the treating physician at that time considered an immunology and administered oral corticosteroids in tapering doses to this patient, but the patient only showed marginal improvement. Since there was no response to treatment with steroids, the patient was re-evaluated. On repeat inquiry, with leading questions, the patient recalled the history of a road traffic accident 5 years back. And according to him, the patient was managed satisfactorily at that time. On re-examining the leg, we found a leg scar, and on everting this area, we found a raised area which, on whipping with a wet sponge, got a gritty sensation. The patient also gave a history of a leg tear repair, which, as per his belief, was of very trivial nature. Now we thought that this could be either due to an extruded suture or a retained foreign body. So we gently explored this lesion with a forceps, and a small glass piece came out of this lesion, the size of which was 3 by 1 millimeters, and this was removed end-piece. Following removal, the patient became asymptomatic, and his best-corrected visual acuity became 20 by 20 in due course of time. So with this, retained foreign bodies lead to an acute inflammatory response, which can lead to spontaneous exclusion of the foreign body, or if this response is insufficient, the foreign body becomes embedded, as in our case, as it was a large foreign body. This leads to chronic inflammation, which leads to a granuloma formation, which can sometimes masquerade as malignancy. And there are several isolated reports of foreign bodies causing granulomas and sometimes masquerading as malignancies. But to the best of our knowledge, this is the first case presenting an ulcerative scleritis. In our case, the foreign body was a glass piece, and due to its transparent nature, might have been missed at the time of primary lip tear repair, and therefore was retained for several years before it produced clinical manifestations. The retained foreign body led to an inflammatory response, which ultimately eroded the tarsal plate, and this led to a granuloma formation in the conjunctiva. Large central punched avascular conjunctival lesions with surrounding heaped up margins have been described as conjunctival O signs previously. And I conclude with a take-home message that retained foreign bodies may remain silent for several years before they may produce clinical manifestations, and they can masquerade as scleritis or scleritis, and cases of scleritis not responding to steroids should prompt a re-evaluation in every case. And therefore, the importance of elaborate history taking and a thorough clinical examination is very, very essential in all cases of non-responding ulcerations to clinch a diagnosis successfully. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Archana. That was a nice news report. We now go on to the next topic on Never Shake a Baby by Dr. Nirohi Dani.
Thank you. My paper is on Never Shake a Baby. What is shaken baby syndrome? Shaken baby syndrome is a syndrome which is a triad of subdural hematomas, retinal hemorrhages, and cerebral edema, and this is caused by intentional shaking. In these children, generally there is no visible signs of external trauma. To show you a small question or smaller film on how it gets produced. When there is violent shaking in a fit of anger by any individual, the brain has a countercoup effect where it strikes against the cranial walls. And then you get these form of petechial images which aggregate together to form a large mass. And then what you get is bleed. The subdural vessels, they break down, there is a bleed either in the subdural or in the subarachnoid space, which later percolates into the eye, where we see our findings. Now, to go over what we found. This happens because there is the child cries, so there is stress, frustrations, parental skills are less, there's lack of support, fatigue of the patient, of the parent, and lack of connection to the infant also causes this problem. So let's go over to our study. It was a retrospective study between 1996 to 2012, where 10 patients were seen which were either reported or suspected. They were sent because there were some ophthalmic findings. There was no obvious history of trauma in 9 patients, but only one confessed to shaking the baby in a fit of anger. So the history is that of a perfectly normal child going bad suddenly from no apparent cause. And history of child, if you go further into the history, you get a history of child who left with either the servant or the relative or an impatient angry parent. So there were 20 eyes of 10 patients, of which males were 6 and females were 4. The age at presentation varied from 3 months to 6 months, and they followed up to 16 years till date. Now, the symptoms that we found in most of these children were that there were some who had the head turned to one side, an inability to lift the head or turn the head, pinpointed, dilated, unequal sized pupils which were observed by the parents also, blood pooling in the eye, bulging or spongy forehead, no smiling or vocalization, poor sucking, swallowing, rigidity, semi-consciousness, lethargy, decreased muscle tone, difficulty in breathing, seizures or spasms. They came with warning signs of poor feeding or eating, completely lethargic, there were seizures. Children also came in a state where they were in coma or cardiopulmonary arrest with no history elicited for this occurrence. The diagnosis was, to confirm the diagnosis, X-ray scan, CT scan, X-ray, CT scan, MRI, lumbar puncture was done. These children were admitted in the ICU, and the acute phase consisted of monitoring the intracranial pressure, and if there was a bleed in the brain, there was a drainage done immediately. Now when we come to the eye, 20 eyes of 10 patients, 16 of whom had retinal hemorrhages, both superficial and deep. 2 eyes had a subhyalite hemorrhage, 2 eyes had a hemorrhagic RD, 1 had a retinal detachment, 2 eyes had hyphema, 4 had subconjunctival hemorrhage, and 1 had a totally black eye. These were some of the eye pictures, the subhyalite hemorrhage, the OCT showing the same over there. And these were some of the victims which were of SBS. And the treatment given to them was injection of long-acting gas or anti-VEGFs in bleeds, injection of TPA to patients with gas, drainage of subchoroidal hemorrhage with vascular vitrectomy and circular injection in 2, RD surgery, that is a vitrectomy with the other procedures in 3, submacular hemorrhage drainage was not done in any patient, and laser to retinal breaks was in 1 patient, and this says glasses were given to 9 of them in the follow-up period. The neurodevelopmental issues which we found were found in 9 patients, of which cerebral palsy was in 4 patients, autism in 1, the ADD in 2 patients, the attention deficit hyperactivity syndrome was in 1, and dyslexia was in 1 patient. So the prognosis could be from either total recovery in a child or to death, where 1/3 of the patients die, 1/3 survive, but they have major neurological issues, and 1/3 survive in good condition. So most frequently the neurological impairments are learning disabilities, seizure disorders, speech disabilities, hydrocephalus, cerebral palsy, and visual disorders. So what can we do for these shaken babies? It requires a multidisciplinary approach, and expertise in all specialties of medicine is generally required, and also services and supports are required to help these babies and the children and the parents out. The rehabilitation of these babies concerns, first is that if you have a crying child, you pacify the child. There are 5 S's, that is swaddling, stomach position, shushing, swing, sucking in these children, which helps them stop crying. And visual rehabilitation is then done for these, where we rehabilitate them with glasses, where we find a sizable difference in a child who was earlier not able to see. This is another child who had cerebral palsy. Just a few pictures more. This is a CP child who has been trained to walk. And this is another child who was done very well after the prescription of glasses. This is as she is growing up, different phases. She is now 6 years old.
please conclude.
Okay. Another autism patient. So when you can't soothe the baby, better that the baby cries than the baby dies. So the dictum is never shake your baby. Thank you so much.
Usual excellent presentation. But before I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned a few cases in which you have given anti-VEGF.
Yeah.
What was the indication?
I just wanted to clear the blood.
I have some questions for you.
Yeah.
How did you diagnose the patient as a patient of shaken baby syndrome? It's not very easy to diagnose.
No, it's not easy.
Because
But
there are numerous issues involved.
Yes.
Whether there are some diseases or congenital abnormalities. Secondly, how did you do an OCT?
see, what happens is that the children came from Delhi to the pediatricians. They had a suspicion of the same because on the history elicited they did not find any kind of history. They sent them for an ophthalmic examination. And when we find these retinal hemorrhages and then you see that there is no other issues, they have kind of worked up the patient because the child was very aggressive and did not found any other relevant thing. Then this is a diagnosis of this exclusion. So that is how they came to. Then you go deeper into the history with the parent. Sometimes you kind of threaten the parent that you'll be handing them over to the case. They don't give you the kind of history, and that's the way you come out with this history. So it is not that at the inception that you come to know that this is a shaken baby, because these facts are always hidden. They never tell you this. It's only like when you cross-question them and threaten them that they come out with certain repertories like that.
Intraoperative OCT?
Intraoperatively. It was done.
Under GA.
See, the thing is that it's like how we do fundus photography for prematures. We did the OCT also in the same way. We held the child on that thing and we got the.
Did you record some sub-ILM hemorrhages in these patients? Sub-ILM hemorrhages?
But there was one patient who was like that.
Because that is a common presentation in shaking babies.
Yes. Because that was one picture if you saw was of a sub-ILM baby.
The next paper is on role of spectrotomy OCT in the diagnosis of ocular stenosis by Asmalini Das.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Neetu, speaking on the role of spectroderma and optical tolerance tomography in the diagnosis of ocular stenosis. We have no financial videos. Coming to introduction, ocular stenosis is caused commonly by retention of any iron-containing intraocular foreign body, mostly following trauma. Injury classically occurs while hammering or grinding of metal. The aim of our study was to demonstrate the use of spectrophromine OCT in ocular stenosis. We have a retrospective interventional study of 2 cases. First of all, we did a complete ocular examination which included visual acuity, slit-lamp biomicroscopy, gonioscopy, and dilated fundus examination. Additional investigations such as X-ray, CT scan, pre-orbits, D-scan, UVM, ERG, and spectrophromine OCT was done. This is the first case where a 30-year-old male presented with history of trauma to the left eye 10 years back. On examination, his visual acuity was 6/6 N6 in the eye, but he had a corneal scar which was seen with iris heterochromia, and he had a cataractous lens. Posterior segment examination, vitreous cells were seen, artery alterations with yellow pigment clumps in the periphery, and photoretinal pigment mottling was seen. We did a SUOCT. It revealed reduced retinal thickness with multiple globular high reflective opacity in the retina, which was similar to peripheral macrophages on histopathology. The electroretinograph showed a cone cord dysfunction, rod cone dysfunction. And in our second case, it's a 31-year-old male presented with history of injury to the right eye 2 years back. He underwent cataract surgery before presentation, 2 weeks before presentation. He had an iris hole, he had a corneal entry wound could be seen, and we could see an iris bulge, a nerve slit, and on retroillumination a cataractous lens was seen. He had an X-ray with him which suggested multiple foreign bodies in the orbit as well as on the lip. Posterior segment showed a glistening dots of pigment degeneration, which is suggestive of cirrhosis, and ERG showed a decreased amplitude response. SCOCT panel showed you could see the oak entry in the cornea and the porous body sitting at the angle. So, on discussion, ocular cytosis is a severe sequelae of detailed intraocular foreign body. The iron atoms or ions get released from the foreign body, which may diffuse to the retina and produce irreversible cellular damage. SCOCT would be reduced retinal thickness with multiple globular high reflective opacities in the retina, which was similar to the ferritin laden macrophages seen on HPE. I'm sorry I couldn't get an HPE picture. To conclude, spectral domain optical coherence tomography can be used as an ancillary investigational tool in the diagnosis of ocular cirrhosis. To the best of our knowledge, SCOCT findings has not been reported earlier. Thank you.
Any questions from the audience? Thank you, Dr. Neetu.
We'll be announcing presently shortly the winner.
Padma Award, and he will be telling us, we could have a round of applause for him, please. He'll be telling us about academic ophthalmology, which he has been doing so well, and he has also been training so many people under him who are also doing academic ophthalmology. And then we have Dr. Chitta Ramamurthy, who, along with Dr. Murthy, has a very successful practice down south. And they do good quality work, and they're also very active in conferences, so they are both into academics as well as the private practice option of ophthalmology. And she will be speaking about whether solo or predominantly solo practices can still survive in today's competitive world. And then we have Dr. P.N. Nagpal, who of course needs no introduction. He's a doyen of ophthalmology, most of us know him, and he'll be talking about a topic that is close to his heart. He's been speaking about it at various fora, which is the option of group practice, which is perhaps the need of the day. Then we have Dr. Ritika Sachdev, Dr. Mayapal Sachdev, who's the Czar of corporate ophthalmology and has also been speaking at IIMs about corporate ophthalmology. And she'll be speaking about the corporate eye hospital chains that are opening up, and they are perhaps the inevitable future. We have Dr. Suresh Pandey, who has done a lot of academic work in US and Australia, and then he rotated his campus 180 degrees and then started doing private practice in Kota, a small city in Rajasthan. So he has had his perspective from both sides, the overseas academic option as well as the bread and butter private practice that we do in India. He'll be speaking about the overseas opportunities that we can pursue. And I'll be giving you some changing trends and an overview of the topic. Since Professor Gupta has another session where he has a lot of involvement, so he'll be speaking first about the academic ophthalmology option for youngsters. Professor Gupta, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Doshi and Dr. Deshpande, for asking me to speak to this group of young people. And possibly one reason could be that Dr. Deshpande came with us long time back, and before he went offshore for trying a career in academic and research, he did visit me for the last minute advice. So probably that he remembered and asked me to speak. So when we talk of a career in academics, what we mean by academics is that you do, it's a 3-in-1 job. That not only you take care of the patients, but you also do a lot of teaching and also do some kind of serious research. And when I say research, it's not only presenting papers, which many youngsters carry away with the idea that research is confined to presenting papers and participating in conferences only. So perhaps that's a mistaken belief, because hardcore research is what is expected for a person who has a career in academics. So I'm going to be giving you my perspective. There could be so many perspectives. Why dream a career? It sounds so like a dreamlike situation. You know, when you are growing up as a small child, you want to be, you know, you see a train driver, you see an airline pilot, or you see a soldier who want to come back. Okay, so when you are growing up, you see your teachers who are honored, felicitated. You wish to be like one of them. So the role models are already there right through the university class. If you develop during those formative years a passion for research, that means wherever you are sitting, whatever class you are in, and you are a student in MS ophthalmology, that I believe that most of you have done or doing, whenever 2 or 4 or 5 of you are sitting together, you are not discussing movies, but you are discussing, you know, something related to the patient that you saw, or the paper you read, or the paper you talked about, or new breakthroughs that come in. So you really have to be, you know, teaching each other, sharing your, you know, what you saw the day before, you know. So you have to have that passion. Okay. Of course, when you're surrounded by young students, and they are really the main driver for people like me, it's the youngsters who surround you day in, day out all the time. You know, they serve as drivers. That if you wish to be surrounded by young, talented, some of the fittest people, brilliant people, you like their company, so you would like to pursue a career in academics. Then again, what these challenges, you don't want to go into the path. You learn a technique, and I see most of my colleagues in Indian ophthalmology, they learn how to do a catheter well, or how to do a LASIK well, and the whole life they would spend doing that, or chasing the surgery. Today, it will be 10 cases a day, then a day will come and you are not satisfied even with 50 cases a day. If you keep going on and on, a robotic life to lead, you don't want to face a challenge. But since some of you, you know, some of those people would drop an UPS or would have a complication, 1 out of 100, and they would have recorded it, they would show it all over the world how they dealt with that complication. Okay, that's not really an academic. Here you want to see on a daily basis a challenge. It pushes you to the limit. Okay, if you're driven by that kind of challenge, okay, you want to climb a mountain, you know, you need to climb that mountain. Okay, if you feel challenged, you know, that would give you a kick. You know, if that kind of kick it gives you, then, you know, you are the kind of person who's going for academics. This also provides an interaction opportunity for, you know, if you are a group of 5 or 6 glaucoma experts in an academic setting, basically institutional setting, the public or the private hospital institutional setting, there are a number of these in the country. Okay, where there are so many of these. So you are not actually asking for any favor and not doing a favor, but you are sharing, okay, this is the problem I came across today. So during tea break or lunch break or, whenever you're sitting together, you have an opportunity. When I see many of my students, many of my colleagues who are in their solo practices or in group practices, they feel challenged. They say, well, I saw a patient, what do I do about it? They don't have any peer group to discuss those kind of. So if you're that kind of person, this provides a very, very good opportunity to have a free, without any fear, a free interaction among yourselves. And of course, if you're driven, that you want to extend the boundaries of knowledge, if you're working on the edge of what is known and what is not known, and you want to tread that kind of path, then this could be another driving force for choosing this career. And of course, the kind of kick you would get, and I can still recall the first paper that I published several decades ago, it gives so much kick, it gives so much, you were full of energy at that time. And if your paper gets cited, and if it gets cited again and again, I think you don't need anything else but this kind of a driving force, that your work is getting recognized world over. So that really is an academic, career. Then of course you get a chance, some of you have presented papers or going to present papers in this kind of meeting, the regional or the national or international. And then finally, you start, this is where, when I began, I used to feel, how come, these guys are the ones who are giving lectures. How come I'm not running with so much work? Why am I not being recognized? Okay, why am I not being invited? Okay. So you reach a stage where you will start receiving those invitations, and many times you have to turn down those invitations. So this could again be something, which set you up, for higher goals in your life, that you feel again very capable. Then of course you don't have to spend. If you're working in an academic institute, somebody is spending money in the public or the trust or the private institution, you as an academic person in the institute doesn't spend a single penny. And you get to work on top of the line equipment. That is, something technology changes and you start saying that, well, I need this, and your team says, well, you can get it because you have shown a good track record, so you could go into the academic line. It's a low risk if you land a permanent position, which are rather rare these days. I'm not sure whether we as academic people get more respect just because you have more number of papers, or you get invited to conferences and meetings. Is it the flashy car that you drive or your colleagues drive and they're in practice and earning lots of money? Okay, that gains the recognition and approval of the society, I'm not so sure. And finally, your work gets recognized. Okay, your work gets recognized beyond the boundaries of the city, state, region, country. Somebody talks about your work. It gave me a lot of excitement when one of my students in Covenant was attending a session in Los Angeles, and the professor there was talking about something which I published, and without realizing that this boy is from the same institute, and he went on and on and on. So when he came back, he was so excited, he was so thrilled. He came and told me, sir, your paper was being discussed there. What bigger gig can you get than no amount of money can give you that kind of a gig when somebody is discussing in remote corners of the world the paper or the work that you've done. So then what are the problems? So I've given you enough reasons, 13 of them, why you should choose a career in academics. What is expected out of you? You have to have original research ideas.
Hello.
You need to know how to ask research questions. You will be asked to teach. You have to teach the course in, say, open-angle glaucoma, and gonioscopy, and perimetry, target technology, or laser photopopulation, a number of these things you need to do. You have to design how you will teach, whether it's going to be hands-on, it's going to be some kind of a basic lecture format or whatever. And conducting research is again expected of us. How to design a study, what should be the objectives, how you will collect data, how you will collate, and how you're going to interpret it. And be able to again publish in impact journal. Many of my friends are happy publishing in some of these letters, which are institutional letters, which are not recognized as, do not have an impact factor. They are not recognized anywhere. They are not. You can't search them on any of the usual search engines. So please don't waste your time publishing those kind of journals. And I said about teaching, supervising research by the students, and of course, that's the better about it. You want your students who are entering into academics to be able to speak confidently about what they're talking about. They may have a good content, but if they fail to speak, confidently, it's good. Now, when you are deciding about choosing a career in academics, you should also keep in sight the challenges. First, and these are the questions you have to ask yourself. Nobody can answer these except yourself. Do you have it in you? This is the tagline for career and academics. Do you have it in you or do you not have it? Does it clash with your personality? Does it clash with your philosophy of life or lifestyle? You want to drive a flashy car, you'll never be able to drive. You want to attend an evening party. Okay, you want to participate in all the functions of the family and relatives and friends. Now, because you don't control your time. There's no time for social functions, no time for your family. It's all the time, patience, research, teaching, 12 hours a day. Pay package is limited. Can I have one? And these days, I can assure you, some of the guys who carry iPads and smartphones in classrooms, for a teacher, it would be a major challenge. He is not up to it. And if choosing an academic career for the next 10, 20, 30 years, you will be challenged by an array of these smart devices who would give the answer within no time. The reality check finally. The initial years are full of uncertainty when you are embarking upon this path. This would be no sure career path. Nobody on this world can tell you that, well, you join today my group and you will reach the top. People thought at one point in time they could get away without publishing. No longer so. Hard work is not enough. Somebody claims I'm very, very hard work. Resilience, that is real. That's the thing. You have to be open to receive. I have been criticized in open forums about my beliefs. I've been shouted down, I've been stopped. My papers get rejected, and rejection rate could be as high as 70%. Okay? Are you able to take it in its own stride? Do you get into a gloomy mood? Do you start shouting at the student because your paper got rejected? Okay, the comments, the initial comments in the initial years, the comments I used to get on my paper, these guys don't know how to write English language. They don't know the use of article, the use of the, they would criticize you on any front, your methodologies, your conclusions, your interpretation. So, you have to be absolutely, and of course, I'll not talk much about networking. You see it in place even in this conference, kind of networking that goes. And academicians are, of course, expected nowadays to write for external exams. So you have to have research ideas, and you should have the capability of writing for exams. So friends, my young friends, when you choose academics, how should you go about it? Make an informed choice. Keep your eyes and ears open. Don't, because your friend went into academics, don't follow him. Okay, you have to make your informed choice. And I again say, The tagline for this would be, if you have it in you, then only choose. If it is not an alternative vocation, that, I come from this category and I'm getting a job opportunity, I can assure you, and I see some examples around you, if you are not good, you will lead a life full of frustrations. Because you got easily into an academic career and you're not able to perform to it or keep it up to it, you will have every day full of miseries and frustrations and humiliations. Don't embark on that path. Know your own commitment levels. How often in your life, daily life, you have kind of compared, I must finish this article this night and show to my chief next morning. If you don't feel compelled to write that and you say, well, I'll do it, don't lose it all. Know your competition, the huge competition, and discuss with your friends and mentors. Look for opportunities around you. Have a contingency plan. Don't put all eggs in one basket. If I get it, otherwise you're lost. No. Have a contingency plan. And finally, my advice to you would be, set a time limit that I'm going to try for the next 3 years to get into an academic position. If I don't get it, I'm going to choose. You have a contingency plan. Okay? Set the time frame and move on in life. Thank you very much for your